got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
Welcome back to Ministry of Truth. I am host and the only host on this station. Obviously, it's me, Javi. And for those of you, hello, Zippity. For those of you who watched my future from earlier, talking about Canadians and their boarding schools, or what would they call them? Can't remember. But where they would take the Indigenous people of Canada, they would take them from their parents or kidnap them off the streets, as we saw in that one guy's case, as young as 3, take them to these schools and assimilate them to forget who they are. Well, not really who they are, but who they are by erasing their history. Basically, how do I say this? Indoctrination, I guess. That's a good word. But some of those schools ended up abusing sexually and physically the kids. And at some point, some of these schools, they're all closed down, but there have been mass graves outside these schools, which I guess are the kids that didn't assimilate or just got abused and didn't make it. But when they go and view these or open these graves up to check if there's anybody inside them, they're empty. So where did thousands of kids in Canada go? And it would be hard to believe if Canada was the only one that was doing that. But guess what? Canada wasn't the only one doing that. Check this out.
The federal government detailed for the first time today the brutality and treatment that Native American children suffered when, beginning in the 1800s, they were forcibly moved into U.S. boarding schools. Leaders of different tribes and communities spelled out a litany of horrors that they say led to a cultural genocide that still impacts Native Americans to this day. Amna Nawaz looks at what the investigation found.
Judy, between 1819 and 1969, thousands of Native American, Alaskan Native, and Hawaiian Native children attended these U.S. government schools, part of a system of over 400 facilities spread out across 37 states or then territories. More than 500.
These are just reported numbers. More than 500 dead, obviously. That's going to be a little skewed because it would imply that the United States government was doing shit like killing kids. Yes, Laura, residential schools was this morning. Now we're doing Native American boarding schools. We like to change it up in America, which makes us sound smarter.
500 children died while attending. Kids as young as 4 were forcibly removed from their families, transported across the country in some cases to schools where they were banned from speaking their language, forced to do manual labor, and suffered physical and sexual abuse. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland spoke today about her own connection to those schools during a difficult and emotional press conference.
The fact that I am standing here today as the first Indigenous Cabinet Secretary is testament to the strength and determination of Native people. I am here because my ancestors persevered. I stand on the shoulders of my grandmother and my mother, and the work we will do with the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative will have a transformational impact on the generations who follow.
Also at that event was our guest, Deborah Parker. She is CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and a member of the Tulalip tribe in Washington. The coalition works with the government on this report. Deborah, welcome to the NewsHour, and thank you for making the time. We could hear it there in Secretary Holland's voice. I heard it in your voice when you were speaking earlier today, too. It was difficult. And I wonder if you can just...
Not going to go too much into that. Just to let you know, that happened in Canada, which caused me to go look into this in the United States as well. And that story that they were talking about, almost word for word, what they reported on the boarding schools in Canada, or residential schools, Laura. Like I said, that United States, come on, we got to step up our game, right? Right. So let's talk about some of our own boarding schools, and we might have a history of murdering our own as well, which we know we have. But like Laura said, this happened in Canada, happened in United States, probably happened in Mexico, all the way down to South America and across the world, as Telly would tell us. Same in Sweden, but I don't know if it was to this. Yes, I'm high.
In the United States Midwest, a harrowing search is underway to locate the graves of Native American children taken from their tribes and sent to boarding schools.
These were not schools. It was a prison camp.
From as far back as I can remember, I've heard this story. You know, my mom would say she's still lost somewhere.
The recent discovery in Canada of more than 1,000 graves at former boarding schools exposed the state-sanctioned abuse of Indigenous children. The blueprint for these schools came from across the border in the United States.
No.
Now Native American tribes in the US are demanding justice for the forced removal of their children, and a bigger, untold story is emerging. A landmark federal government report now estimates tens of thousands of Indigenous children could have died at US institutions.
I don't like calling these things grave sites or cemeteries. I don't call them that. I call them crime scenes.
Yep.
That's what I call them.
In this report, foreign correspondent gains exclusive access to one community as it begins a journey to uncover the truth.
Hey, Laura, do you know if Fifth Estate has any copyright infringement things? If you do, let me know, just in case. Because they've got a lot of good videos with them.
Yeah. Straight. Heichi. Deichi. Wakata. Kuria. Ihadu homini.
On a cold winter's morning, these Native American children are having a lesson in language.
Okay, that's your format. Are you ready? Here we go. Sapa black AIP.
Sapa black AIP.
Shah red AIP.
Shah red AIP.
The language is literally the heart and soul of our people. It holds our identity, and it holds our practices, our beliefs, our philosophies, our worldviews, all inside the language. So our existence is directly tied to it.
There was the we.
Redwing Thomas is one of a few who can speak Dakota, his tribe's language.
Practice this word with me. Say, emakiapi. Try it again. Emakiapi.
Less than 5% of my people, we don't know our language. We are on the verge of reclaiming it, but it's an uphill walk, you know, and we have a long way to go. It took generations to wipe the language out. It's going to take generations to restore it.
She ignored him.
He blames the US government's boarding school policy for destroying his people's culture.
As Native people, we've been severed from our language, from our culture, from our practices over a whole course of time. But the boarding school era in the course of history, did a number on our people where we almost did not recuperate from it.
From 1819 to 1969, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their tribes and placed in state and church-run boarding schools across
Holy
the US
fuckballs.
and its then territories.
No fucking way. Look.
The school.
And this is funny considering the location. Come on, motherfucker. Are we doing this? So if you look here, look at Hawaii. Oddly enough, there's missing kids in Maui
The
right
schools, under the guise of education, were a dark experiment in assimilation. The model for the schools was devised by military officer Richard Henry Pratt, an Indian hunter.
Yes, Laura, because one of the reports I found, the last one to close, or last to close was in 90. They stopped taking the kids in the 1991, which I found kind of strange because that was not that long ago.
By stripping away culture, Pratt believed he could kill the Indian and save the man.
When you have a motto, kill the Indian, save the man, I mean, come on, that's as genocidal as it gets.
Oh, it
The
gets
schools
worse.
were created for one purpose only, and that was to destroy our belief system, to destroy our family system, and to change our identity.
By 1926, 83% of Native American children were enrolled in these institutions.
83, huh?
Everyone in this room literally descends from a boarding school survivor. I mean, that's just the truth.
Red Wing's grandfather, Albert, was sent to boarding school at the age of 8. He attended one of the largest and longest running institutions, the Genoa U.S. Indian Industrial School in Nebraska.
He never really talked about it, and it wouldn't be until later, later in his life, where stories would be shared. One experience shared that a soiled sheet would be used to be wiped in the mouths of the other children who spoke their language. And if they didn't want those dirty sheets and soiled sheets shoved into their mouth, well, then you stop speaking your language and start speaking English.
That
That's
sounds
pretty
like some
hateful.
Nazi shit.
That's pretty evil.
This entrance and a few buildings and barns are all that remain of the Indian Industrial School in Genoa. Once a sprawling campus housing children from more than 40 tribes. Today, it's a place where people come to learn the history of what happened here. This building, once the school's workshop, is now a museum run by the Genoa Foundation, a group of local volunteers.
Hi, Nancy. It's so good to see you.
Judy Gashkabash's mother, Eleanor, went to school here.
I'll let you look at your mom's window that was donated in her honor.
Like many survivors, her mother didn't talk about her time at boarding school.
She would talk about it, and there was sort of a haunting look or a
Strange.
sadness to the tone.
Because I've seen a lot of Canadian boarding school interviews where they were talking about it, but you can see that it literally, you can tell it just demoralized everything that they were.
Tone of her voice. She tried to tell the good things.
It says my mother's name there, but I don't know.
I don't have a lot of pictures of my mother because, for one thing, they made them be photographed for everything, and my mother detested having her picture taken. So I look at that photo.
Right, Laura, that was ultimately what this whole series was going to go into, because I'm going to relate it to modern day, what happened in Maui.
They have, and I say, one of those girls is my mother. My mother cooked and baked breads and rolls and food that the children ate. However, most of the time they went to bed hungry.
To try to learn more, Judy began attending the school's reunions.
I started going to the Genoa Indian School reunions after my mother died, so I got to learn about what it was like and meet people that could have been at school with my mother.
The Genoa Foundation's secretary, Nancy Carlson, started the annual gatherings more than 30 years ago.
Former students were coming back asking information about the school and saying they wanted reunions and this sort of thing. And so we thought, you know what? These people have this real need. Let's try to help them and do that.
3, good, super, I got you.
This reunion was the first. Filmed in 1990, these pictures have never been broadcast.
First year I came, I stayed 2 years.
As the school has no living survivors, they offer a rare glimpse into what life was like for some former students.
So what was your day like? What time do you have to get up and all?
I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You never got any other time off to make up for it.
What did you learn here?
Well, I guess I don't know. I learned to, I'm not really sure. I guess I learned how to get along, with other people, strangers, being around strangers. Here too, I know.
Huh.
This was just like a military school. We had to march everywhere we went. After dinner, we went.
Wait, did he say the Winnipeg school?
Church and marched.
These were not schools. It was a prison camp, a work camp. It wasn't a lovely place to learn your education.
It looked like a military camp, yeah.
They were little soldiers. Every morning, the whistles blew. You had to get out of bed. There was nothing of home. You were stripped of all your cultural belongings. Your hair, which is so sacred for the boys, was all cut off.
Hmm.
It was a self-sufficient school, so the children were used as labor.
Oh,
You learned
used as labor. That goes back to my interview I did with my buddy L, where the prisons, that's exactly what they are now. Especially the private ones.
3 hours half the day, but it was a very watered down curriculum. It wasn't stimulating. It wasn't with the goal that you could be anything. Dreams could come true at the Genoa Indian School for these children. No, the dream was you will be a servant.
Many students left the school with their culture broken. Others didn't return home at all.
What is important about where we're standing now, as far as you know?
Only that it's where we think the cemetery is. The only reason.
Why would there be a cemetery with the school?
Yeah.
Well, kids started dying at an early age. I mean, at the early time they were at the school. They had to do something with them. I don't think it was possible those days to send them home, the bodies, I mean. So they buried them here.
James Nash attended the school in the late 1920s. At the reunion, he revealed 2 of his classmates died at the school. He believes their deaths were covered up.
I searched the archives in Washington, D.C. for a week, and I never found any record whatsoever of these 2 deaths that I personally knew about.
Why do you think that is?
I think probably whoever was operating the Genoa Indian School had those records destroyed because they were derogatory to their image.
Government. Yep.
He took some of the people from the foundation board, or some of the guys, and they went out and they looked where he thought it was, but they couldn't find any markers or anything there. The next day they had like a grader that came in and just removed the topsoil to see if they could find where their graves, and they did not find anything. And so it was because of that they didn't find anything that they decided we were going to do this, set up a marker that's just to the east of this building to honor those former students that died.
Okay. So, I think within the past 2 weeks, the Canadian government has said they have all these, and they call it a mass gravesite, but there's no human remains in these grave sites whatsoever. So how is that? How is there a mass gravesite? And if there were all these kids missing, as I stated in my show this morning, where are they? Where did they go? They obviously didn't die. Which is going to culminate at the end of this whole series. I promise you.
The remains of 215 children, some as young as 3, buried for decades on the ground.
More unmarked graves uncovered.
Hey, can you have her send me those links? Because I kind of want to look into them. I'd appreciate it. Oh, well, fuck.
At another Catholic residential school.
Last year in Canada, the discovery of mass graves at the sites of former boarding schools shocked the world. But with more than double the number of schools in the US, the government says tens of thousands of Indigenous children could have suffered the same fate.
At no time in history have the records or documentation of this policy been compiled or analyzed to determine the full scope of its reaches and effects. We must uncover the truth about the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of these schools.
A historic federal investigation into America's own boarding school era is now underway. In Nebraska's capital, Lincoln, Judy Gashkabash heads up the state's Commission on Indian Affairs. She says it's time to tell the truth about what happened at her mother's school.
And we know it's
When
never
we
going
first
to happen.
heard about what was going on in Canada, I said, we've got to focus on the children that died here. A cemetery at a school is not the norm. That
Right.
you could die at school and then you're going to be buried out the door.
This whole history is almost invisible. People aren't aware of the fact that we're going to find these kind of graves. We're going to find missing children here in the United States too.
Judy asked historian Dr. Margaret Jacobs to find out how many children died at Genoa.
It should be interesting.
When I started trying to find out what happened to the children who died, the first place I looked was the government records.
Oh, that's the last place you want to look.
Nothing. So that's when I started doing some newspaper searches.
She soon began uncovering reports of students' deaths.
Spinal paralysis, heart failure. There's a lot of accidental deaths. We've come across a drowning, a child who was hit by a train.
What the fuck?
Their diseases were sweeping through these schools. But in many cases,
Thanks,
they
Laura.
weren't returning the children to their homes when they died, and they were burying them on site. And it's just kind of chilling to me,
Yeah.
to think that for so many children, the schools were death traps.
Those who grew up in Genoa knew and understood what happened here. It was a point that we were taught in school about Native American boarding schools, assimilation, but we weren't aware of the cemetery. At least I know myself, I didn't stop to think about the students that died here, what happened to them.
Nobody does.
Nikki Drews volunteers with the Genoa Foundation and is helping investigate student deaths. She recently discovered more children had died.
We have found 86 students that have died, but without having the actual government records, it's hard to say how many there really are.
Zippity. Calm down. Because even that is all included as in culmination. I promise you. Because it's going to prove what I've been saying about the old world. Well, in my opinion, I'm proving that I was right about the orphan trains.
Really are. It's almost 100% that there are more students that have died.
Laura, we actually really didn't learn a lot about Native Americans in school other than what tribes were in our area. But then you have people like me and Casey Moe and a couple other people. We have questions, we want answers. And it just happens I need the Native Americans to find my answers on the old world.
One of the 86 children who died at Genoa was Carolyn Fiskus's aunt, Mildred Lowe.
I have an old picture of my grandmother and my Aunt Mildred, and Mildred looks like she's about 3 years. And they're wearing white people's clothes and shoes. My auntie must have moved, you know how little kids wiggle.
In 1927, Mildred Lowe was taken from the Winnebago tribe and sent across the plains of Nebraska to school in Genoa.
They put her on the train and it started moving.
Oh,
and
train.
That train whistle would blow, and then she got to Genoa and she got off, and that was how it was. It was horrible, lonely and scary.
Oddly enough, Laura, Illinois, I think in the United States, they might have the most boarding schools out of the entire country. And there's a reason it's called Indiana.
Mildred died 3 years later. She was 12 years old.
To lose a
Oh,
child.
fuck, I'm
and then
sorry.
To lose them
Laura, I meant Indiana. I'm fucked up. I just saw the I state. It's Indiana.
in that way, you don't know what happened to them. It's a very sad story for our family. This is my wall of fame of my family. This is my mom and dad. This is on their 50th wedding anniversary. I think we had this taken.
Calm
My
down,
dad's a little
Zippity.
bald-headed white guy, and my mom is Ho Chunk. And then this is my son and daughter, their graduation pictures. And these is my pride and joy, my grandchildren. Put my Aunt Mildred up there with my grandmother. There they are. For me, it's like this is missing, this piece.
Carolyn has spent the last decade trying to find out what happened to Mildred after she died.
She's probably at the spirit world, but she didn't get a send-off. But everybody's there. We believe our ancestors are there to greet her. But, you know, we want her spirit to know that we know that too.
Carolyn has recently received Mildred's death certificate.
Oh, wow.
It reveals Mildred died from influenza and meningitis.
Damn.
When I got it, I was like, oh, you know, just reading that is just kind of like you say, oh, now this is real. She really did die there. And here's the evidence. And it's hard. I think it's hard for me. Pray for all the spirits who haven't come home yet. Pray for them to find their way on this smudge and on this smoke.
The document states Mildred's body was sent home to the Winnebago
No problem, Zippity.
reservation,
Thank you for coming.
But Carolyn is skeptical.
They didn't have any record of her being buried in the Winnebago cemetery. And my grandmother's record was there, but we didn't have Mildred.
She believes Mildred was buried at Genoa in the school's lost cemetery.
You want more than just to come here and see this, right?
That's right. I'd like them to definitely locate the cemetery,
What's up, Frogger?
fence it, probably a monument of some sort.
More than 30 years after James Nash first mentioned the cemetery, a new effort is underway to find the children's graves.
In this situation, with this story of Native American boarding schools, there's a certain, it feels like there's kind of a sense of urgency. It'd be nice
Well,
to be
we'll sit
involved
back
in
and
that first step of finding them.
gonna hear some tales about how our government wants to erase an entire history. And I'm going to expose them at the end of all this.
State archaeologist Rob Bozell is overseeing the fieldwork.
The only map that has been found that depicts a cemetery is this 1899 Nance County Atlas. And I don't know if you can see that, but right there, the word CEM for cemetery and a cross. That's a symbol that cartographers use for cemeteries. This is a very coarse scale. Again, they're depicting something south of the railroad tracks and east of this property line, but it doesn't give us enough detail to say exactly where it is. We've also got air photos.
There you
It
go.
shows that the cemetery is somewhere in this area.
Now, I know they make drones
It's a
that have all kinds of sensors on them now. They use it for mining, they use it for cropping, they use it for, well, we're going to use it to go find underground caverns. But can't they see what's underground? Well, I guess not, because if they wanted to find it, they would, but they don't want you to find them
It's a big area.
because
Probably
they're empty.
200 acres.
Using ground-penetrating radar, Rob and his team
There it
are
is.
looking for disturbances in the soil, which could indicate a grave shaft.
I was talking about
This
modern activity
pyramid-looking
or
thing
technology.
represents a difference in soil compaction. Could be a grave, could be a big animal hole that's different than the surrounding natural soil. We have another one here, same shape. And we also had two same shape going up a little farther here. So we have potentially three or four anomalies.
The discovery creates cautious optimism. It will take months to analyze the data.
It's more than we've seen on our other 2 or 3 trips out here. I don't think we saw any anomalies anyplace else. So we are at least seeing those. Whether they're signatures of graves or not, don't know yet.
My name is Philip Swantek.
Hello, Philip.
Born and raised here in Genoa.
Phil Swantek owns the land where the search for the children is taking place. He believes the canal, which was constructed shortly
sure
after the
did, didn't
school's
they,
closure
Froggy?
in the 1930s, destroyed the cemetery.
And you have to realize when they dug that canal, they had a dredge or a drag line that you could fit a big truck into on the scoop. You know, and in the 1930s, I don't think anybody was too much concerned if they run across bones or anything.
But no records have been found that construction disrupted any graves. Phil says he has mixed feelings about what will happen if the cemetery is found.
I own the land, and my opinion is if they did find something there,
They flooded
I would
it.
probably want it memorialized some way, but not disturbed.
They flooded the cave.
Eight of the children who lost their lives in Genoa belong to Nebraska's Omaha tribe.
You know, they're speaking from the grave. You know, that's just how we see it. We're here. Find us, bring us home.
Chairman Leander Merrick says if the cemetery
I
is
thought
found,
I was
the
joking
Omaha
about long
tribe
hair.
will repatriate their children and lay them to rest
Cultural thing.
on their ancestral lands.
They have to come home. This is their home. To bring them back here is going to bring closure for them, their spirits, and their loved ones, and our community as a whole. This is shining a light on the United States.
Oh
It's not a
shit!
good light. They wanted to eradicate us. They didn't want us to be a threat to them because of what they were doing. You know, the bottom line is they wanted our land.
And they wanted your history.
Across the country,
Our
Native
history.
American tribes are mobilizing as they begin searching for their lost children. There are calls for a reckoning for the trauma caused by boarding schools. Dr. Samuel Torres is from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, based in Minneapolis.
This moment, as hard as it has been an important moment to remind folks from every background that this is an important part of the story of the forming of the United States of America, that this land was once Indian land, and it still is, and it always will be.
He says there needs to be a commission of inquiry as the first step towards reconciliation.
Boarding school survivors are not getting any younger, and there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of information that needs to be shared. Truth.
That's been skipping a lot my generation's lore. That's why I'm trying to bring it back. And even my son has long hair.
Cannot be done without a focus on accountability and justice, and only through that can substantive healing actually take place.
For Red Wing, keeping the culture alive is key to healing from a painful past.
So in my classroom, we reverse it. For the ones who had to go through it. So we reverse it. Instead, it's a happy atmosphere. Instead, it's joyous, and it's exciting, and it's enthusiastic. And it's everything that our ancestors were forbidden to have. That's why there's so much energy in my room. It's for them.
This is real. They really were here. It was 20 years ago that I was last here, and we're still looking for those children.
Yo, out of the two countries' documentaries and questioning I've heard so far, neither one of the Native Americans, well, they're all North Americans, have once used the term white man to talk about the oppressor.
That died.
That's interesting. Almost like maybe it wasn't all white men?
In Genoa, the recent search failed to locate the cemetery.
They're there somewhere. We know they're under the ground somewhere, and they need to be honored.
Efforts to find the children who never came home continue.
I can't rest until I feel I've exhausted every possible avenue to find the children.
Well, that's the first video of the two we're watching today. Kind of just had this thought. What if these recent wildfires in Canada, as well as the northwestern part of the United States, what if those are the spirits saying, hey, come look here? Wouldn't that be interesting? Or does that just sound crazy? To me, it sounds plausible. But anyway, let's go to another news segment from Al Jazeera. We're doing Al Jazeera because they did the one they did on Canada was very informational. Plus, they have a whole series, which I got to go look more ones I watch. But like I said, this has been going on for far longer than most people think, and it has nothing to do with Native. It does have a lot to do with Native Americans, but they are the ones they don't want you to read about in the history books. There's a reason why they want you to forget about what happened to the people, and why they want their own people to forget who and where they're from. It's all about changing the history for them.
What if one day someone just came here to the house and just took you away and you never saw your parents again and they never told you why?
She was only 9 and my granddaughters will be 8 soon. So thinking back boggles our minds that this happened and what they had to go through.
Uh-oh, Frogger. This is why I'm here. I find something, I verify, and then once I verify, I run with it. And all this just happens to be something that I've been looking for the good part of this century, which has only been 23 years, but still.
An Indigenous group in Canada says it's discovered 751 unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school.
Indigenous leaders are calling it a crime against humanity, the second such discovery in less than a month.
The Indigenous people from Canada, they always knew it was there. They said, you need to look to our neighbors to the south of us in the U.S.
Things like that happened here. Kind of want to brush it aside. Hopefully it stays buried. Hopefully it's not brought out in the open. That we've had those kinds of atrocities happen to us here in the United States.
I've talked to elders who tell me that all the children in the village had to leave, and there was an eerie quiet in the village. There was no sound of children.
The headmaster whipped my bare back with a rubber hose. I couldn't breathe, couldn't catch my breath. I passed out. Little boy said they had to hold me up for one more whip. Our stories need to be heard. This part of the United States history has to be told.
Exactly. Someone's got to let it out there. Even as small as I am.
Very capable student. Respects rights of others, has a friendly manner. One report said little Jimmy was blocking the doorway. When we first heard about the children buried at Kamloops, Canada, that brought back a flood of memories for myself and many in my generation of our own experiences in boarding school. It was just kind of riding under the surface of our consciousness. Here's my dad, my mom, and me when I was a baby. When my dad passed away, we became of interest.
A lot of states are actually rooted in their Native American names. And I believe even Chilago is one, and that's modern day Chicago. And they have a rich history of ties and culture.
To the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it wasn't very long before the social workers in Fairbanks forced my mom to make a decision. Give your children up for adoption or send them to boarding school.
Which is essentially was the same thing.
Our mom with Kermit and I. She chose to send us to boarding school with the idea that at least we would be together in the summertime when school was out. On our way to the airport, our mother made us a big apology saying that she's sorry. We're going to have you go to boarding school. This was in the fall of 1955. We were taken to the town of Wrangell into this huge kind of government enclosed enclave that kind of rose out of the mountains and trees as Wrangell Institute. We were not quite sure what was going to be in our future.
See, the other one's Nebraska. This one, Alaska. 37 states, remember?
The government said that it was becoming too expensive to continue killing Indians. Let's educate them. Let's assimilate them. He was a rabid assimilationist. So it was, let's kill the Indian in them and save the man. The whole basis for his boarding schools was to get them as far away from the culture as he could. Forced assimilation and forced Christianity, the work ethic in a complete military style format.
Oh! What?
No one had ever
Religion?
asked the federal government how many boarding schools they ran. No one ever asked the churches how many boarding schools they ran. So I decided to dedicate as much time as I could to research how many boarding schools were in the United States.
It was, Laura.
Just recently, I've come up with 400.
Because if I remember right, your pope, well, yeah, I'm not Catholic, even went there to apologize recently, within the past 2 years.
At the school, the first place we went to in the boys' dorm was a large open area, a concrete floor, and there we were ordered to get completely undressed. Many of us did not know each other. And here we are, we're standing in this receiving room, and some children who did not understand the commands to get undressed, some matrons were frustrated enough they ran over to that little guy and just literally tore his shirt off, off his body, and forcibly pulled off his pants. Of course, the child was in tears, was frightened. There was a lot of eerie silence among the other kids who were watching
in the
this.
fucking 50s.
The little things that we had brought with us were basically confiscated, and we'd never seen them again. And we were ordered to get in line. Each kid was assigned a 2-digit number. And that 2-digit number was written with indelible ink on our clothing. Here's one from 1960. My number was 68 that year. It was very dehumanizing to the extent that some
That's
matrons
definitely
were
military.
fond of
That form
only
still exists.
referring to us by our number. We were handed government issued clothing, and then we were marched off to our dorm rooms, which is basically a military style barracks. We got settled in for the night. That's when some of them started to cry. It started off with little whimpers, little sniffles, but it caught on. All it took was for one little child to start crying, and then another one, and then another, and then another, to a point where the entire dorm room of little kids were just wailing into the night. And we all cried ourselves to sleep. Waking up the next day, our eyes are swollen shut, and the process was repeated over and over and over until the middle of the school year. I don't think any child cried anymore, because no one's going to come and get me or hold me, tell them that they're loved.
The buildings were cold, they were underheated, the kids were hungry, and they were half worked to death. The discipline was horrific. The kids were killed. They got killed working in the barn or working out in the fields. They were overcrowded.
Oregon.
So they died of TB, measles. They died of typhoid, pneumonia, and the flu. I had a reporter ask me or say, well, the history of boarding school was written out of the books. And I said, well, it was never written in. It's not in any history books.
Yep.
My father was 9 years old and he was sent off to boarding school. This is Daddy right there.
That's fucking crazy.
My interest in boarding school began listening to my father and my mother.
Look, they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. So pretty much send them to school or lose them anyway. This was Canada and the United States. Keep this in mind. And this is shortly after we got Alaska, I believe.
They tell stories about their boarding school days. There isn't any Native person alive today that hasn't had someone that went to boarding school in their family.
Of course not.
For more than a century, the Interior Department was responsible for operating the Indian boarding schools across the United States and its territories. At no time in history have the records or documentation of this policy been compiled or analyzed to determine the full scope of its reaches and effects. We must uncover the truth about the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of these schools.
When they started reporting on the missing children in Canada, it brought back memories of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the school there.
That's in Pennsylvania. Oh.
This is my grandmother. My grandmother.
I actually believe they use that area now in Carlisle as the U.S. Army War College. Because there is a Carlisle barracks in Pennsylvania. The whole installation.
Her sister was Mary Kinnock. Sometime in the 60s, Grandma said to Mom, Sister Mary went to school and she's buried there. When you hear words like that, you don't know to ask other
Filipino.
questions because you're shocked by the words that you just heard.
We all grew up with clinking names.
So
Mom
did
always
she.
wondered, what did that mean?
Like my grandma.
In the late 60s, she started doing some searching for what happened to Mary. She had this photo captioned William Kinnock and daughter, taken around 1903. And we both discussed, could this be Mary? It's hard to know. Does she look like a 9-year-old girl? She looks like a little girl. They took Mary and 30 other children from
I'm pretty
Southeast
sure though,
Alaska
like back
in
then,
1903.
kids who are 9 actually look like they were 9 instead of kids today who are 9 and look like they're about 37 because of all the GMOs. Well, we don't have you guys don't have GMOs in Canada, but the steroids and stuff they put in all the meat. Well, I think they still do that in Canada as well.
They went from a temperate rainforest where there's lots of trees to a country that's flat and has trees but
Barren.
not like home. So it had to have been so much they had to adjust to. It's an awful lot to ask of little children. It's a lot to ask for adults. It's a long 8 days to figure out what's going on. Once they got to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, it was an immediate transformation into becoming westernized. Outing rules to govern Carlisle Indian students and our patrons. Pupils are placed in families to learn English and
Laura.
customs of civilized life. Outings were under the guise of teaching people how to do housework, how to learn how Western culture works in a household. But it was kind of like free labor. Here was the first evidence that Mary had gone to an outing. Mom was trying to find any information because she knew she died at Carlisle. State of Alaska Department of Health and Welfare, 1967, 1985. It took a long time. This was over several years that she was writing back and forth trying to figure out who has what information. 1993, June 2008, Mary Kinnock, and she finally found those 2 pieces of paper
Actually,
that said
Ghetto.
she had been there and she got sick and died.
I was actually at Fort Riley too. I was at Riley from 2008 to 2013.
Confined to bed in hospital for past 2 weeks, irregular temperature, weakness, and emaciation. My cousin's a family medicine doctor. When he read that, he said she must have had TB, just by that little bit of a description.
What? Wait a second. If these little kids are getting tuberculosis while in these camps, so do they fill sanitariums as well? Because you'd think if they're infected, if they get TB and they're in close proximity with all these other kids, it's likely to eradicate them. And those are the ones that survived were the ones that got retrained.
When I first went to Carlisle and went through all the names on the stones,
Yeah, just let me know, man.
I was overwhelmed with so many children. There was no Mary. 14 graves had markers unknown in the school cemetery. We figured she must be one of the unknowns. They moved the cemetery to where it is today.
Of course they did.
And the records were not good. They can't keep track of children. That's when I got my first anger about the people not knowing.
Keep
what
that
we've
in
gone
mind.
through.
She said they moved the graves. So all these empty grave sites. I'm not a genius. I don't claim to be one. I just kind of put some stuff together.
During the boarding school time, they did start that cemetery over there. There's a lot of old graves there. A lot of kids died from disease. I was going to boarding school here. Meningitis, pneumonia, flu.
All from being in close confinement.
This used to be dormitory at one time when it was boarding school. The little boy in the hat here is my dad, Eugene Sr. When he went to school here as a boarding school student, he had bad experiences. It was a Catholic school, and they were suppressed. He was suppressed in speaking his language. He said there was times that he was punished for being caught speaking the language, and they'd get disciplined. He was traumatized by that. The impact from boarding schools was language loss, even cultural loss.
Yep.
I'd even hear elders one time, the kids that went to Carlisle or went off to a different boarding school, that they come back and they were, in a sense, they were changed. Like they didn't want to speak their language, like they didn't want to do their cultural ways.
The overwhelming thing that all matrons looked out for was to make sure that no child spoke their language. They had a thing called the gauntlet, and a child could rack up some demerits. Sometimes those demerits were for speaking your language. And during that gauntlet, children who had these demerits were forced to become completely undressed and walk and run naked down a line of children who were on both sides of them, using their belts against their fellow students.
Wow.
And sometimes some kids used the buckle end. Some of these kids hit pretty hard because if they didn't, they would have to go through the gauntlet. Another day, which will always be seared in my memory, is a friend of mine was knocked out. This grown man just took his fist and just hit the side of my friend's face so hard that it splayed his face open all the way under his ear. And
just ask if I know that name.
Face just fell open. He was instantly unconscious. He was bleeding profusely. He was taken to the hospital. And for the next 6 to 8 weeks, I think he was a daily reminder that this matron could do anything he wanted to. Because this matron was never fired, never admonished, never went to jail.
Not even reprimanded?
Besides the physical punishment, there was psychological abuse and, of course, sexual abuse. Wrangell seemed to attract pedophiles, and a lot of boys in the boys' dorm were sexually molested. Yeah, when I was about 10 years old, I had written home, and I was writing about some of the abuses I saw and experienced. And my mom didn't do anything with what I wrote her about, so I thought she didn't care.
She didn't get it.
But what I learned when I was much older and she happened to remember was, she said, when I got your letter, there was large parts of your letter that was blacked out. I guess today we call that being redacted. So a lot of the things that I talked about, my mom could never have known about because it was just blacked out. That's when I was at Wrangell, right there.
You know, this is the kind of thing that should anger people. This was government-sponsored genocide, trafficking, rape, and anything else that you can think of is what happened to these kids to erase an entire history of the world. Ask yourself why it happened both Canada and North America, or Canada and United States. It's not a coincidence.
I was 13. at the end of the 10 years that I was in boarding school, I knew everything about the world, but I didn't know who I was.
What the fuck? What just happened?
What happened in boarding schools is a cultural genocide. After finding my dad's
That was fucking weird.
what happened in boarding schools is a cultural genocide. After finding my dad's records, I just broke down and just sobbed and sobbed. To think of this 9-year-old boy ripped away from everything he knew.
That was weird.
I decided as a professor that I wanted to do a qualitative interview study of boarding school survivors. There were themes that came out. Number one, of course, was loss of identity, loss of language, loss of culture, loss of ceremonies, to his loss of their parents and a sense of abandonment. Then there was abuse, there was corporal punishment, forced child labor. They were hungry, malnourished, and there was sexual and mental abuse. There was unresolved grief. The survivors I talked to, several of them had never told their children or their grandchildren. There was another elder that said, when do we tell our boarding school stories? Thanksgiving dinner? You know, do we say, oh, I was molested for 5 years by a priest at boarding school,
Jesus,
at a family dinner? So there's just this resounding silence of boarding school survivors. Because when do they tell their stories? What format? How? Who? No one's ever asked them. They can't talk about it. This one gentleman, he patted the back of his head and he said, my boarding school story will stay forever there.
I mean, I'm not laughing at the story, guys. I'm
Intergenerational
sorry.
trauma has been handed down to even those that didn't go to boarding school.
There's that term, generational trauma.
Let's go through our exercise of introducing yourselves. Hatose. Nanana hananae. Without a language, you don't have a culture. My dad and mother talked about how they were raised in the boarding school, especially the language. They said, we're going to teach our children English. We're not going to speak our language to them because we don't want our kids to go through the same thing we did. This intergenerational trauma. It does something to you up here. It seems like it carries on into the next generation. Our fluent speakers are really low. I've been working in earnest, trying to find ways and trying to work ways to get this language out to the kids. But who taught me was my mother and my grandma, my dad's mother.
Good, good.
She taught us in Arapaho when my dad wasn't there. What we're saying there in that song is, oh, my people, look at your flag. It is being raised. It is raised and flying in the wind. This flag song. I used to always sing that song when I was a little kid. And my mother was in the kitchen. She heard me. Then she said, I'm going to teach you the proper words. So she did. I always kept that song in my head. She told me the meanings to the words. Well, hey, near down there. Well, hey, Janica. That was the Arapaho Nation flag song. Well, hey, Siapka. Sometimes I tell them, Okay, you guys are going to grow up. You're going to start families. To keep this language and this culture alive as being Arapahoes. Follow along after me. Bahi na son of Bahin. Try to not forget it. Try to remember it. It's our language that keeps the Arapaho blood going, keeping it alive. Hatchet na habesa. Hatchet na habesa. Hatchet na habesa.
I ask now, what are we being healed from? What has been the problems? It just carries on from generation to generation, from the traders, the disruption in our language and our culture. I don't speak either language because my parents both believed that we would never progress in the Western culture unless we spoke English.
Mom wanted to know who her family was. So that's why she would go out and try to put the picture together to say, who are we? Why are we scattered? Why do I not know this part of my family? What happened?
Jesus Christ, her whole family got sent.
So Paul, William, and Martha never returned. You know, it's a big hole in your family. But that was the goal of the school and the churches, was to cut family ties. And that's what Mom worked hard to have, was a close-knit family. I think for Mom, the beginning of the healing of our family was to find out where our relatives are. It was very important to her. It's important for me to finish Mom's journey. To have Mary so far away, it's like, no, we need to bring the family home. Mom was trying to find all the dots, put them all together, make the story complete, is to bring her home. This is part of our hurt, that we need to figure out how to start healing that hurt.
I discovered when I was attempting to tell my story, I couldn't finish. I got caught right here in my throat. I couldn't let it out. And that was another indicator that I hadn't done my own healing work. What got taken away, not just our culture and language, but things like parenting. When I had my own children, I could relate to them until I was 8 years old, because that was the age I was when I first went to boarding school. And I left boarding school when I was 18. So my own children, I just couldn't be a parent, an effective parent for them while they were in that age group themselves. My wife, being a social worker, knew that the source of a lot of my anger was my early experiences at boarding school, but I didn't realize it. And I started going to therapy, group meetings, talking circles, healing circles. I was able to let so much of my stuff that I had carried on with me all this time. And it was such a relief to know that I didn't have to carry it with me. I'm a firm believer in sharing stories, even with my grandchildren.
Same.
And even though it may not be in the history books, I'm going to tell them about things and experiences that I had in boarding school. I think justice for me would be to hold our government accountable for allowing a system like that to prevail for so many decades against generations of children.
Well, as you can see, obviously, not only was it going on in Canada, now we know what's going on in the United States. And why is all this happening? Because it's happened in history. Since the beginning of time. On kids disappearing, kids getting re-educated, so to speak, re-indoctrinated. And it all comes down to one thing. And when you guys hear it, you're going to be like, holy shit, this dude was right. Or you're just going to think I'm completely fucking nuts. Either way, that means I'm right. But up until a little while ago, I didn't actually know that these boarding schools existed. And this is earlier this week. Like I said, it took me no time to find stuff. But everything I found made it lead it like it was toward a conspiracy or that it was a good thing. I don't take no for an answer. I'm going to find it. And you're going to hear it. Or you're going to see it. I know there's no drama in this, but it still involves kids, so hopefully that's a plus, but also it goes into my I hate the government, and the government is not your friend. So I'm not telling you how to think, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls and children of all ages. I'm just telling you to think because this is happening. And no one really knew about it. Except for a small group of people. And now, at least 3 more people. 22 more people know. Okay? Please like and share if you want to. Don't care. Just let somebody know that this is going on. And get to know your Native Americans. They might know more about our history than we know. And which will prove my point, I guess, so to speak. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed the show. Take what you needed and think on it and make your own opinion because